into a protein called cyclophilin 23. And that this complex, so the protein and the OPDA, can then influence the stress defense, for example, by changing the gene expression and then producing proteins that are important for stress defense. However, there are a lot of factors that we do not know yet. So we don't know about any receptors or something like that. There's a lot that we still have to find out. And that's what we are working on. And this is getting more complex if you look at this image, because every phytohormone interacts with other phytohormones. So for example, the OPDA does not act only by itself, but it also affects auxin, it affects ethylene, abscisic acid, and many, many other plant hormones. So when you think about the stress signaling, you also have to keep in mind how one hormone might affect the other. So as you can see, it will be a very, very complex network. There's a lot to find out. And this is also dependent on the actual stress condition that you have in that moment. So the interaction during drought stress might be different from that during salinity stress, for example. So we have to do further research on this to really understand how this affects plant stress defense. To do this research, of course, we have to use these phytohormones somehow in lab. We have to have them in our hands to somehow study on them. And that's why we need to synthesize them. And that's what brings me to my second part of this presentation, which will be distinctly shorter. So this is green chemical biosynthesis. And this basically means that you include all steps, all adjustments that you can make your chemical production more sustainable and more climate friendly. So for example, there are 12 principles. I will not name all of them. But for example, green chemical biochemistry includes that you eliminate the waste as much as possible, that you don't create toxic waste, that you also switch to biodegradable or natural resources that you use for your synthesis, and many, many more other aspects. That's the second part that we are working on. So in a cooperation with the research group of Dr. Harald Kröger, who's also in our university, we are trying to improve OPDA synthesis, for example, by upscaling so that we need less organic solvents and so on. So we are basically working on OPDA signaling and also OPDA synthesis. To sum this up just really quickly, we hopefully have seen that it is very important to further study stress defense in plants to hopefully create more stress resilient plants in the future that will be able to grow and to produce food also under increasing stress conditions during climate change. Furthermore, while you do this research, while you study the stress defense, you should take care to make it as green as possible so that you also, for example, care for green chemical biosynthesis to not create too much pollution and so on during your research. Of course, these are only two factors that we should talk about today. There is many more that can affect climate change, how we handle it, and how we can reduce disasters. So that's hopefully what you will hear about in the coming sessions and coming talks. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone who contributed to this. So everyone from my working group, which is the working group of Professor Dr. Dietz in Bielefeld, and also of our cooperating working group, also in Bielefeld from Dr. Harald Kröger. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Madita, for the speech. Now we have Dr. Panvel Chekhov with us, who would be talking about molecular priming as an approach to induce tolerance against abiotic stresses to crop plants.
I'd like to interrupt for just a minute. हमारे बीच में पुष्पराजगढ़ के पूर्व विधायक श्री सुदामा सिंह जी मौजूद हैं। हम उनका हार्दिक स्वागत और अभिनंदन करते हैं। स्वागत है सर आपका। Please carry on.
Thank you for the introduction. So we're here today to talk about climate change. And unfortunately, I don't have the answers how to mitigate climate change, because this is a topic we have to discuss together and reach some conclusion. But what I can tell about is how we try to help plants survive climate change and adapt better changing future. So I'm coming from the Czech Republic, specifically the second biggest city in Czech Republic called Brno. Czech Republic in the center of Europe, and you can see it here on the slide. And what is actually very interesting about Brno is this is the place where Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, conducted his work. more than 100 years ago now. And the greenhouses where he conducted his experiments with bees are actually only 3 kilometers away from our universities. So when it comes to climate change and the way plants deal with climate change, they're exposed to changes in the environment which negatively impact their yield. And there's no need to give specific examples, but you can see here some of the reincarnations of climate change can be extreme temperatures. This could be cold, this could be heat. We have drought conditions, which is not good for plants. But we also have pathogen insect attack. And here you can see some examples. For example, we have an insect attack where aphids attack plants. And for those of you who don't know what aphids are, these are like mosquitoes which suck on plants. What is interesting about the way plants respond to stress conditions is that they accumulate reactive oxygen species. So this is something we understand about the molecular mechanism behind their response. And these reactive oxygen species are basically derivatives of oxygen. And you can see here on the pictures how they are short-lived. And when I say short-lived, this means like milliseconds, nanoseconds. And because of this, their short lifespan, they can be very damaging to biomolecules. So don't go into details here, but you can see that these reactive oxygen species can damage or convert various biomolecules like DNA, like lipids. They can also attack proteins. And this all has negative consequences for the plant, which eventually reduces yield. So in the past, what people used to do, and what we summarized recently with colleagues, is they would overexpress proteins that detoxify these reactive oxygen species. And here you can see examples of such proteins which are basically distributed in different cellular compartments. And their main function is to reduce the levels of reactive oxygen species during stress responses. So they can be in the chloroplasts, in the mitochondria, in the cytosol. And perhaps the most notorious example of reactive oxygen species production is the process of photorespiration, which happens in numerous compartments, including peroxisomes. And for those of you who don't know what photorespiration is about, this is a process basically which is related to release of CO2 under light conditions. And it was invented by a famous scientist, Otto von Warburg, in the past, who is also famous for probably the shortest project proposal ever. So he simply requested for 10,000 francs to be given to him to conduct his research, which is in a stark contrast to what we are doing today. So, but the most important thing is that photorespiration is probably the second biggest metabolic flux after photosynthesis. And it starts with the activity of rubisco, which is the most abundant protein on Earth. So usually what we know about biomass production, everything happens through the activity of rubisco by carboxylation of ribosobiphosphate here, you can see on the left. But at the same time, this enzyme, even though it's so important, it has a promiscuous activity. So it catalyzes another reaction, and this reaction is very frequent, especially under climate change conditions. And this is the reaction which I'm talking about, which initiates photorespiration. So by the action of oxygen and ribosobiphosphate, there is a compound called phosphoglycerate which accumulates, and this is toxic. The compound has to be detoxified, and this happens over numerous steps during the process of photorespiration. And one of them, the most important for ROS production, is the accumulation of hydrogen peroxide, which happens in the peroxisomes. And you can see here, like in this yellow crystal, this is the amount of catalase which is present in the peroxisomes, suggesting that it's actually very crucial to withstand such flux of an accumulation of hydrogen peroxide. And what is interesting is when this enzyme is absent, hydrogen peroxide cannot be detoxified and these plants die. And I can actually show this if you don't believe me. So here on this video here, I'll play it now. We have a mutant on the left, which is lacking the enzyme called catalase, which removes the hydrogen peroxide. And on the right is the wild type plant, like the normal plant which we see in nature. And basically, when we expose these plants to conditions which trigger photorespiration, which is actually what we see under changing climate, you will see what happens with the catalase deficient plants. If I can start the video. Sorry, can you please maybe start the video from the... Yeah. So look carefully what happens on the left. So these plants over a period of 24 hours will slowly die, whereas the plants on the right, which is the wild type and are perfectly normal, they will survive the stress conditions. So this is actually very important. And for the next slide, you will see that actually the effect of hydrogen peroxide which accumulates here is not only destructive. Here, what we have done is we treated plants with a chemical which induces hydrogen peroxide production. But what happens is when these plants are pre-treated with hydrogen peroxide and exposed to stress, they can survive, suggesting that the plant can actually be primed or prepared to experience a harsher stress in the future and survive it better. So this is the whole idea about the way we try to help plants survive these stress conditions by actually treating them with certain molecules called priming molecules or molecular priming molecules. And by doing so, we prepare them better to survive stress conditions. And there are quite a lot of examples of such molecules. Some of them are more useful in practice than others, including hydrogen peroxide. But what I want to show here as the last slide is an effort, concerted effort with partners from around the world to actually produce and improve molecular primers which are based on seaweed. So basically, we try to prepare some sustainable solutions which can be used on a whole agricultural level by the farmers to actually prepare their plants against stress conditions like drought, heat, and pathogen attacks, and have a way to counteract these climate change conditions. So this is also an important example of how people around the world can work together, because we have partners not only in Europe, but like in South America, South Africa, and we try to work together to achieve something towards mitigating climate changes. So thank you very much. I forgot to mention, final slide, these acknowledgements to the European Union and the European Commission for funding this research at Auto.
Thank you, Dr. Pavel, for a very intriguing session. Now we have Dr. Vijay presenting to us what he thinks about plants' exposure to combined stresses using existing molecular diversity for survival in nature.
First of all, I would like to thank you for very kind introduction in the beginning by Dr. Renu. And I would like to thank you, my speakers before me, that they introduced plant stresses so well, so I don't have to do it. I can talk about things that are more important to me then. When we talk about sustainability, we are talking about, let's say, agriculture, food security. Why don't we start from the very beginning when it started? The story started roughly 12,000 years ago, Stone Age. That was the first time when humans invented settling at a place and agriculture. And it was not only this, the crescent that you see here in green color, but independent of any communication between different humans. During the 2,000 years, between 12,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago, it was invented independently in 7 different places. And the most common crops, if you read their names, corn, rice, wheat, potato, cassava, sorghum, millets, beans, barley, rye, and oat. These were the first cultivated plants. Now, we know that this cultivation, this invention of agriculture was a big step. However, it's surprising that since 12,000 years, still 95% of the food that we eat today is coming from these 11 plant species, which is not saying much. So that's where the food security question starts. According to World Economic Forum, there are roughly 821 million people. So this is a report from 2019. And 1 in 9 people in the world, especially in developing countries, are suffering from lack of nutrition or lack of food. When we talk of agriculture, we know it's important. However, in terms of its importance for climate change, we can understand that agriculture leads to roughly 30% of greenhouse gas emission. Worldwide, 40% of the people are employed in agriculture. Naturally, we know if we want a sustainable future, if we want to support the growing populations, we have to generate means that agriculture can survive. We know that there are several stresses, like my previous speaker said, for agriculture sustainability. Sorry. So there are multiple environmental factors that affect plant growth in nature. Let's talk about nitrogen. We all know green revolution was only possible because of two factors. Number one, special hybrid varieties of wheat, and nitrogen fertilization. We used artificial fertilizers which were nitrogen enriched, and if you check the data from last 50 years, at least from 1960 to 2009, it becomes clear that the growth of agriculture, wherever the yields have increased or nitrogen use efficiency has increased, it is only or mostly because of the natural mechanisms like nitrogen fixation by microbes. You can see that there is a direct or good correlation between biological nitrogen fixation, but not for synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. On the other hand, these synthetic nitrogen fertilizers also lead to pollution of groundwater, for example. Therefore, we learn from nature that these natural nitrogen management mechanisms are better. So when we think of nature, we know that there are not only one problem. Nitrogen is only one problem. There are multiple problems we have. So we think about what the plant biologists can do. Is breeding or genetic engineering, for that matter, can help? Maybe. But we have to look into nature. Does it provide us with meaningful, suitable targets for breeding approaches? Continuing with the subject of nitrogen, only in the model plant Arabidopsis thaliana, we know roughly that there are roughly 70 putative transporters for nitrogen. However, only 20% are those that we know anything about, and the rest of them are unknown. And this situation is even dire in crops, for example. Similar scenario exists for several other plant metabolic activities and not only for nitrogen. Therefore, it is necessary that we find novel gene functions and resolve new interaction networks of proteins so we can have new experimental approaches which can help us in this direction. And therefore, what better than to understand from nature? When plants grow outside, we don't have them growing under, let's say, only salinity, or we don't have them growing under only, let's say, flooding. They are facing multiple factors together. And therefore, these are the names of all factors, roughly all factors that affect plant growth. And you can see that in nature, there can exist a whole array of these combinations. And therefore, in our working group, we are working on many of these combinations. I will not bore you with all this data, but what I want to say that is the findings from these combined stress approaches has already yielded new information, and it has potential to help for sustainability of agriculture. I know that the environmental change topic and climate regulation is a challenging topic, so I would like to leave you on a positive note. When you look at these two photographs, you see two photographs and you look at these, and what do you see? What is the highlighting plant? I'm sure this one here on the left-hand side, this big grass, it's not very important. On the right-hand side, you see maize plants immediately. However, sorry, the pointer is not working, but I can show you this tiny grass at the bottom. And you will ask, what is it? I can give you an answer. Roughly 9,000 years back, people in Stone Age have cultivated this tiny grass and have created the maize plant. In Stone Age, just think about it. We are living in 21st century. We have all the engineering, all the modern technologies that could ever exist in our lifetime, maybe. And if they can do in that time, why can't we? So we should look at what are the possibilities. And if we look closer to Amarkantak, or let's say closer to India, the Tiger project, which was started 40 years back, you know how successful it was. So why can't we? That's the question, and I leave you with it. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all the corporation partners for our lab and for the data that I showed. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
So much for your talk, Dr. Vijay. Now we have Dr. Amarnath Tripathi, who'd be talking about the economic aspects of climate change. So till now, we've heard around the planet part of the climate change, as in the green earth, and what we are doing to solve some of those issues. Now let's hear about the economic aspect of climate change.
So very good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thanks to organization for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to share my experiences. Uh, First, when I saw this panel, I thought I'm not the best fit in this panel, but when I listened to the speakers, then I can say I'm the best fit in this session. Why I'm saying I'm the best fit in the session? Because the major challenge that the farmers are facing, that how we can translate the knowledge from lab to the field. So they have discussed the so much knowledge from the lab. Then I'll talk about how we can translate knowledge from the lab to the field with some of my experiences. I traveled extensively in some part of Bihar, Odisha, and Uttar Pradesh. Based on these uh, experiences, what I have learned from the farmers, I'm share some of the informations. I'll talk about the adaptation to climate change in agriculture sector and how we can scale up adaptation to climate change in agriculture sector. But prior to focusing on my topic, let me give you two important facts. One important fact, Vijay has already mentioned that the global population in almost 828 million people are facing the problem of the hunger. And can you imagine? This 200 million people have been added after COVID-19. And this 200 million people is just because of not only the COVID, the Russia-Ukraine war is another important reason of this. And why? Because the 40% of global supply of food production is coming from these two countries that are Russia and the Ukraine. Now, one hand, the hunger statistics has been rising since 2014, not since 2019 or 2020. Now, the latest climate change impact assessment report by the government of India, which says that in 2030, the crop yield of wheat will reduce by 20%. And in 2070, it will reduce by almost 40%. And the rice yield is going to be reduced by 4%. So it's clearly says that the rice is not much affected. Rice is affected. Why it is not much affected? It's because of we are using the groundwater for the irrigation. So when I'm giving these statistics, you can imagine how important is to deal with the climate change if we want to propose some development policy for the agriculture sector. But when we talk about the agriculture sector, we also need to think or keep in the view that not only the agriculture sector, which is affecting by the climate change, agriculture also contributes to the climate change. 30% of greenhouse gases are coming from the agriculture sector only. So agriculture sector is an important contributor to the climate change itself. So we are looking for what kind of development we are looking for. We are looking for a development which can protect the agriculture sector as well as can reduce the emission of the greenhouse gases from the agriculture sector. So how we can do that, how we can adopt the agriculture climate change in the agriculture sector. So so we are basically more talking about the climate resilient agriculture sector. So we need to focus on the climate resilient agriculture in addition of the climate greenhouse gases from the agriculture sector. But it is also true that when you look at the agriculture sector at very micro level, you will see that there are several strategies that farmers have already adopted. It means there is adaptation to climate change agriculture sector. If you see the crop diversification, yes, farmers are diversifying their crop. If you see the agroforestry, you will see the agroforestry also as a strategy of the climate change adaptation, yes. If you see the farmers are using the micro irrigation, yes, the farmers are using the micro irrigation. So there are adaptation to climate change, but these adaptations are the passive adaptation, not the active adaptation. Why I'm saying the passive adaptation? Because when I ask farmers why you have changed your practices, none of the farmers has said I changed this practice because of to protect the climate change or to reduce the yield negative impact of the climate change. Their answer was to increase their income. So still in Indian context or in the developing country context, income security is more important than the ecological security, given the income of the Indian farmers. So that is why we are facing the problem. The passive adaptation is one of the important challenge. And then when I talk about the passive adaptation, then there is a problem of the maladaptation. I'll give you 2-3 examples of the maladaptation. As I give you the example of the agroforestry. And yesterday when we are coming from the holiday home to the university campus, even we have discussed about the eucalyptus tree. And even you can see the several eucalyptus tree in the field also. But when I talk about the farmers, why you are growing the eucalyptus tree, there are other plants also. And eucalyptus is not good for the groundwater. Farmer clearly mentioned that, yes, I am aware of, it is not good for the water, groundwater. But what I do? I need immediate income. The eucalyptus is going to give you income in each 5 years. There is no other way of earning. So what farmers will do? Now, if you see this adaptation, how farmers are increasing the production, they are increasing the use of the groundwater, excess use of the flood method of the irrigation. So the groundwater is day by day depleting. Then excess use of the chemical fertilizer. Vijay has already mentioned what are the negative impact of the excess use of the chemical fertilizer. So there are adaptation strategy, farmers are adopting climate change, but there is case of the passive adaptation and there is a case of maladaptation. So how we can address this problem? There is an important gap of the information, gap of the knowledge. When you talk about the farmers, in most of the cases, I found that only 1 or 2 farmers can define what is climate change. They are aware of there is rising the temperature. They are aware of there is a problem of the rainfall pattern, but explain what is the climate change. And this is the problem of the knowledge. So what kind of information services being provided is not appropriate. And if you see we do have an agriculture extension system. The oldest agriculture extension system we do have, and only less than 10% farmers are getting benefited of this system. The kind of knowledge they are receiving, it's not appropriate. They are not getting the knowledge timely. So this is the biggest challenge the farmers are facing. And if we want to improve or we want to scale up the adaptation to climate change, then we have to focus on this gap, which is the knowledge gap or information gap. So we have to provide the information they should get the access to the information and timely, not the they sometimes they get the flood information or weather information, but most of the time they get information not in the right time. So apart from this, there are two important also factors that I have observed that can be used to scale up the adaptation to climate change. The important fact, another important factor that I have observed, that is the social networking. If there is no government system is working, there is poor extension system is there, then what we can do, we can utilize the social network effect. Because when I discuss most of the farmers, they have mentioned that they are following what the progressive farmers are doing. So we can train the progressive farmer, and then other neighboring farmers can learn from the progressive farmers, so we can get benefited from this networking effect. And then another important factor that we need to be considered, that collectivization of the Indian agriculture. Why I'm saying the collectivization of Indian agriculture is very important, because 90% of land holding are small and marginal. We have three important methods of the collectivization of Indian agriculture. One is a group farming, then we have a cooperatives, and then nowadays farmers producers organization and companies are being promoted by both the government of India and NABARD. So these are different instruments that can be used to collectivize the farmers. And when you are collectivizing the farmers, farmers will have the more bargaining power. And when they will have the more bargaining power, they will be able to get a better return, and their financial power going to increase. And why I'm saying the financial power is important, because finance is, I found, another important challenge for adapting to climate change. So with this word, I would like to end here. So how we can scale up? We have to need to focus on we have to first think about how we can get rid from the passive adaptation and maladaptation practices, and then how we can get benefited from the social network effect and the collectivization of agriculture. And then we have to also think about the information gap. And for the information gap, in my study and another study have been done in Odisha. In both studies, we have found the print media, particularly the newspaper, is going to make significant impact. So with this word, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the insightful narration there. Now I'd like to invite Farid Sicharia, who would be walking us through the policy aspect of climate change.
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you, IGNTU, for having us here. Can we have a huge round of applause for the entire organizing team, which has been working very hard to pull it off? Thank you. So while I begin, I see the audience and I see there's a huge amount of gap or a like landscape which we are trying to address. So we have perhaps students as young as studying in schools, and people who are young by heart, perhaps not by age as much, right? So from the perspective, what I can say broadly is that I'm not somebody from the science background. So I had slight difficulty trying to catch up with a lot of aspects and the terminologies that were being presented. That might not be the case with a lot of you, but that is also a responsibility that a lot of people in the policy domain kind of face. Particularly all our public representatives and a lot of consultants, as ma'am also know, is to kind of gauge through a variety of different ideas and bring forth a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary perspective. And something that is also being promoted through the new education policy in the education system itself, so that we bridge that gap. Now, moving forward, when we talk about the three terms, say climate, people and planet, one of the key things that stands out of it is people, right? Because in the entire climate landscape, जो सबसे important चीज है वो people है, मतलब लोग. आप policy नहीं बना सकते हो, you cannot make a policy without having people at the center of it. Now, even when you individually see yourself and your background, so in all of our lifestyles, so I'll go with the English Hindi mix because I see the audience can relate to both the aspects. So I apologize to my foreign friends who might not be able to understand and catch up, but I have a responsibility to my friends over here as well.
So when we're moving through a youth phase, and a lot of us, when we say watch movies, a lot of us start imagining ourselves or see ourselves as the heroes or heroines of our movies. We are at the center of the entire universe and leading it. So we have a sense of centricism even in our individual self. Now imagine what is the centricism of the entire human race, because we see ourselves at the center of the entire planet. We see the entire climate, we see the entire environment and the entire nature being accustomed to serve our interests, which is one perspective. Another perspective which has kind of been going around, or for example has been historically been there in India, which sees people or humans as a part of the planet. So we are one integral component of the environment of the planet, but not the only responsible or the important aspect, which means that the conduct of the human society has to be in line, accordance, and consideration of how the entire planet is functioning. तो जब आपका mindset determine करता है आप किस direction में जा रहे हो, right? And in the entire climate advocacy space, when we move forward, we can divide it into two separate tracks. Track number one is mitigation. कि अगर climate change हो रहा है तो we have to stop it, because this is something apocalyptic. There'll be a lot of problems. So a lot of things that we continuously read around in the newspapers, whether it's about stopping climate change or net zero emissions by say 2070, 2080, 2050, different targets for different countries. Or for example, when we talk about clean energy transitions, so we talk about say solar energy or green hydrogen and moving away from coal and all these fossil fuels, we are talking about a different uh, mindset where we want to prevent climate change from happening. And not just climate change, basically also the impacts and the symptoms that come out of it. So when we talk about say rising sea levels or melting of the glaciers or changing of the weather patterns, which have a lot of impact, in fact, even on agriculture, which we have been discussing. So what we are trying to do from the mitigation track is to stop climate change from happening and essentially curbing a lot of the activities that humans have been practicing for a lot of time, which have contributed to it. Whether it is our utilization of oil, drilling, a lot of infrastructure building in a different places. So all of these things which we identify have been contributing to climate change and its impacts, and then trying to curb those things or remedify or control their implications or impacts on the environment. And that's how the entire mitigation track works. The other track, which is slightly different, is the adaptation track, which works on the belief system that climate change is not something new that is happening in the past 100, 200, or 300 years, but climate change is something that has been taking place for thousands of years. In fact, from the very time that the earth was created, there's been continuous climate change happening, and the very fact that humans as a species has even evolved, or perhaps when dinosaurs are gone, a lot of species have become extinct, new species have evolved or adapted, is continuously adapting to the process of climate change and its impact and making sure that we survive and come out of it at the best level. So the adaptation track works on a different synergy. It is trying to utilize the scientific developments on dealing with the impacts. And I feel the lot of research that was kind of presented over here about the stressors, their impacts, how to kind of deal with those stressors would come under the adaptation track, where we understand that climate change is happening, temperatures are rising, the weather fluctuations are happening in different regions. How do we say make our crops more hardy to these changes, to these hailstorms, to these rains, or to drought prone circumstances? So this is the research that is entirely going into that domain. Another aspect of the theme, if you look at, is disaster risk reduction. Because essentially when climate change is happening, a lot of environmental aspects are changing. Disaster is going to happen. Now, what disaster risk reduction is continuously focusing on is trying to stop those disasters from happening, or one, essentially when they're happening, how do we make our infrastructure, our people, our ecosystem, our sources and supplies resistant to these risks of disasters? And essentially something which we are seeing at a broader level on multiple aspects. So very recently we have the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum meeting in Detroit, where a supply chain consensus was built by different leaders, the trade representatives of 14 countries. And one of the most important aspects of it is diversification of supply chains. So none of the countries, for example, wants to be dependent on either single country for most of their critical supplies, because we understand that disaster or climate change can affect the supply systems of any country. And since the supply chains across the globe are interlinked, they would affect anyone and everyone. So we need to have a very resilient supply chains, for example. So it works on those tracks. Now, in both of those things, how we are approaching climate is from a perspective of how do we best protect the interest of our people. And this is something that we have to continuously keep in mind. Now, second aspect that I'd go over is how do we put the interest of the people of the at the center, and second, that people are not a homogeneous group, right? So when you look at the globe and how development has systematically happened over the centuries, is because of several historical and socio-economic political aspects. The world is now kind of segmented. We have the developed world, the West, European countries, and then we have the global South, and there are several countries who are trying to bridge the gap. Particularly, India can be a one great example of the same. So you look at countries in different circumstances, they have different challenges and different requirements, and essentially also different burden of the climate change crisis that they have created. And that is why when the countries came together in 1991 in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil for the the Earth Summit, they decided on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and which later got additionalized with the respective capabilities. So the responsibilities on all the countries are different because of their historic contributions and the benefits that they've been reaping. Right. And in that perspective, when we talk about climate change and we negotiate from a youth policy advocacy perspective in these kinds of platforms, our demand is that this is kept at the center. Now, when we talk about how do we mitigate and how do we adapt to climate change, we need a lot of things to happen. But in each of those things, the lens of CBDR needs to be there. So that is why we talk about climate financing or technology transfers. A lot of research that we've been hearing over here, or cutting edge research, is happening, for example, in Europe. But is it because only that the Europeans are capable, or because there is an ecosystem where there are more resources available in the countries? But now, essentially, when there would be more research happening over there, the aspect of intellectual property rights comes over there. So now the technology is limited, and if the developing countries need to utilize these less carbon emitting technologies, they need to pay for that. But where would the money come from? Because we are already burdened with a lot of pressure from these aspects. So the aspect of technology transfer comes into play. And these are the things that we are kind of negotiating. So when we, as for example, Indians or across the globe, when we negotiate or talk about the climate aspect, we ought to understand that we do not get carried away by certain homogeneous narratives about climate change, but understand the intricacies of the same. As Sir also talked about, how when you talk from a farmer's perspective, his main concern is income security and not rather what impact is having in the climate. That is also an opportunity cost that the government faces, because their primary responsibility is simultaneously towards their people and their development, towards the people who still do not have electricity, to the people who still do not have petroleum resources or uh, network supplies. So how do you cater and maintain a balance needs to be taken into account, and any advocacy on climate, which is essential and should be continuously happening, should also wane from this perspective of how historical global development has taken place, how there are different kind of responsibilities on various countries, and how do we take it forward. Another aspect that I'll take forward is of various stakeholders. Now, who are the different stakeholders when we talk about climate change or these developments happening in society? We obviously have the governments which are making these policies. So if there is any new coal power plant that is coming up, or petroleum manufacturing units, or refineries and all of these things, government obviously is one stakeholder that makes the policies, provides the subsidies. So for example, if we have free electricity for most of our farmers, which essentially leads to a lot of, say, pumping in of water resources, that is one policy of the government, right? So governments play one important role. Second aspect is of the people themselves, because the consumption is essentially being taken place by the people. Government also is serving the people, right? So consumption comes into a major aspect. And one of the key missions that the government of India has also recently taken is of Mission Life, that is lifestyle for environment. So it is not that there is less for anybody, but the utilization and overconsumption in certain sections is simply beyond measure. So when you talk about the per capita emissions or per capita consumption of steel, electricity, or plastics, or any of the goods in, say, United States or any of the Western European countries, or for example, India, China, and a lot of developing countries, there is a vast difference, right? And when we talk about Mission Life, we are talking about bringing forth a sense of social messaging where people themselves consciously understand the impact of their consumption and decide to consciously curb and reduce their wasteful emissions, which we have to take on as a social movement and which would solve a lot of problems. And in this broader aspect, the youth policy advocacy aspect needs to target both the government and the people. And we at Y20 have the target to bring forth and understand your voices, your solutions, and then put them forward in the negotiations. With this, I'd like to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it was really interesting to hear different perspectives. Now, if I may summarize whatever we've heard, and I've been very keenly listening to all of our speakers, there are three key aspects: the climate part of it, because dinosaurs probably did not have conference rooms to discuss, oh, if the meteor hit, where will I run? But we have. So, in total, what we found was yes, the climate is changing, and that will impact our food supply, that will impact our food sustainability. To mitigate that, our first three speakers basically spoke about what is science helping us do to help impact that, to remediate that. We can't stop it, but how can we make sure that the food our generations eat from 10 to 20 years later is secured? They don't go hungry, basically preventing furthermore people from going into poverty. That raises another question, which was, I think, very poignantly addressed by our third speaker, that you cannot create a solution in silo. And case in point is Green Revolution. The solution we were trying to create was India's poverty and securing India's food supply. And the way we created the solution was we started developing high yielding varieties and we imposed it on our farmers. The farmers took high yielding varieties of grains, grew them. And an example of that deterioration is Punjab. Those high yielding varieties required so much water that the water table in Punjab today is non existent. There's a concept called as a train of cancer that leaves a certain region of Punjab and goes into Rajasthan, because there are villages of villages that are now facing cancer, I would say cancer impact because of faulty water, or I would say, impacted water. There is so much leakage of all the fertilizers, pesticides, nitrogen, and all other different fertilizers that we added in the soil that it is now coming back and haunting us. So it's very important for us to understand that the solution needs to take care of multiple aspects. Yes, we can create a plant that probably sustains, let's say heat stress. We can mutate the catalase enzyme and make sure that the plant is surviving. But what does it mean for everything else? That's another thing that we have to be very careful about. And finally, when we create these solutions, we have to also consider people who are going to use that solution. Something that the last two speakers spoke of. That is, the farmer is using it today, it's adaptive. It's not proactive. Like, farmer doesn't care because the farmer has to raise his or her family. We care, so we have to engage with the farmers, use the social networks, use community farming to disseminate this information and make sure that the practices that we use are not so heavy on our climate impact. We minimize our footprint. And that is all to summarize it. So I hope this was an engaging session. And now I think we can open for any questions from the audiences.
So myself is Indonesia, and I have a question over here. So actually, my question is addressed to Dr. Good afternoon. Okay, so nowadays we are facing like the rapid development era, like either in business, technology, and etc. But still, in other hands, like few countries haven't done development evenly. For example, like my country, Indonesia. And recently, Indonesia is trying to establish the new capital city to develop the country evenly in Borneo. Borneo is the biggest island in Indonesia, which we have much forest entries over there. And during this establishment, people start saying like, why are you cutting the trees for new capital city? We already have capital city in Jakarta. But also, we look around what Singapore been done. They are as the one and only developed country in Southeast Asia, even they have less trees, unlike Indonesia. So my question is like, what do you think? Which one more important? Like, we have to save the earth first, or we have to develop the country first? Because if we have developed country, we will facing less issues in our country too, like poverty, financial issues, and political issues. Thank you.
I can tell what I think, and this will be my opinion. But at the end of the day, it's up to your nation to decide how to develop, whether to cut trees, to build new capitals, to look for different solutions. From my opinion, I think both can be achieved if we work together. There are solutions to either cut trees or not cut trees. And obviously, it's good to keep the trees there. And the people who decide to cut the trees have different agendas than the people who want to keep the trees. But it's a discussion which has to be brought together in a sustainable way, organized in a way that all sides are heard. And in a way, this is what we're doing here today. We are brought together to discuss in a peaceful, sustainable way our approach to the future of not only the country, but the whole world. So, in my opinion, both can be achieved. And you can have a sustainable, developed country with trees.
Perfect. So I think the short answer is we don't have to do it in either or way. We'll have to find a midway. So you cannot have like no trees and all development and no trees. But yeah, we'll have to look for a middle path there. So looking for any more questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Palestinawati and then I'm from Indonesia. So, actually, what we have discussed today, we have two big lines. The first one is agriculture that has impact on the climate change or the climate change itself that affect the agriculture, right? So, if we take a look back to the history, that agriculture started years ago in Iraq right now. And then what's that? The climate change. If you take a look back to the history as well, that in the past there was a capitalism across the globe. Like there is extreme heat that caused what's that? Drought, and then also extreme cold that cause like the flood or the melting of the ice, right? So what is actually the what is that? Actually, right now that we are dealing the same fundamental issues, right? According to the climate change. Then the question is to anyone. So the question is, what is actually the fundamental distinction between the past agriculture and the present agriculture? So that, like, we are still dealing with the climate change or the catalysm. Right now, we are not having the catalysm, but maybe in short time we will have. So, what is that? So, thank you.
And who would you like to answer that question from the panelists?
Actually, anyone, but I can address this to Mr. Amarkantak. Yes.
So, see, you have to learn from the past as well. So sometimes when you want to deal the climate change problem, there are several solutions that exist in our indigenous knowledge, the traditional knowledge that we do have. There are several solutions that we do have, and some of those solutions we need to adopt if we want to deal the climate change problem. Like in India, if you go in several places, you will find that there are several varieties of the rice or wheat that are more resilient to the climate change. But because of low productivity, now farmers are not growing that. So now we have to think how we can increase the productivity of those varieties that are more resilient to the climate change, right? So sometimes we have to preserve the past knowledge, and the past knowledge is always helpful to deal with the problem of the climate change. Yeah. Thank
Thank you. Sorry, I just like to add that also in answer to the first question and also to combine it with the second one, I would like to just say this much. When we are talking about sustainable development and we are talking about the past problems and the present problems, the fundamental thing that we all have to do, we have to understand that the current situation that we have with climate change is man-made. It's not a natural change of climate that happens again and again and again and again. That's not okay. Temperatures have been variable throughout the past, but this change that you see that has happened within 50 years is man-made because because of our greed, you can say, or because okay, everyone wants a better life, right? So as Dr. Ramanath said, we have to learn from the past, and the result of how to reach the sustainable development is that we have to be conscious about all the things that we plan to do. It doesn't matter if you are thinking about developing a city. It doesn't matter if instead of corn you are thinking of growing rice. What you are doing, you have to be conscious of it, what it can affect in coming years. So that's something that we have not done before. So green revolution was great. It was very useful. People got food out of it. So it was a big boost of food availability that we reached. However, we know that it led to problems. And why it led to problems? Because at some point we thought, yeah, we have solved everything and that's it. We don't have to do anything. The climate, the environment, it is a adaptable, it's very rapidly changing state. So we have to be conscious of our decisions, and I think it's not up to, like, if nations decide then only something will happen, or if developed countries will decide only then something will happen, or if developing countries will decide then only something will happen. It's at the basic level, each human being has to regulate their life cycle and lifestyle, and that does not mean that you have to live in a village in a tiny house. If you want to live in a city, you can live in a city, but it's all about thinking about what you are doing next. Thank you.
Congratulate and thank you very much for such nice lessons you have been for the last 1 hour. So my question goes to Dr. Madita. So how the phytohormones actually that affects this drought stress depends. Any mechanisms there or not?
Okay, so basically, if I get your question correct, it's about how phytohormones can regulate different plant functions under stress conditions, right? Okay, so that's a very complex question actually, because I don't know if you remember my slide, you could see that there's a lot of different phytohormones. So we have jasmonic acids, or the group of jasmonates, which also includes 12-OPDA. We have salicylic acid, abscisic acid, and so on. And I think to really talk about phytohormones in general, you would have to be an expert on every single phytohormone and every single interaction that it has under different stress conditions. So I'm afraid there is no really simple answer to this question. So what they do, quite commonly put and also not very detailed, is that they affect signaling in plants. So for example, they can influence the gene expression, And by influencing this gene expression, proteins might be produced that can then affect the stress defense. Because, for example, as Pavel also mentioned, if you have a lot of hydrogen peroxide in the plant, you can use catalase to detoxify this reactive component. So, for example, phytohormones could activate the catalase to get rid of the hydrogen peroxide. There's many phytohormones known for many functions, so they all fulfill different functions and also additional functions. So, for example, if you look at OPDA, which is what I work on, I actually can't tell you about salicylic acid or so on because I don't work on that. But for OPDA, for example, you have influence under drought conditions, under flooding conditions, also under stress combinations, as Vijay mentioned. So if you combine, for example, flooding and arsenic stress. So I can't give you a really, really concrete example about every phytohormone, I'm afraid. Yeah.
So how these calculates, now when just put down the calculation off. So what actually happens to the other ROC engine? Because it's a complex phenomenon. So all like calculate SOD and others enzymes are in combination that actually acts. So in isolation, the calculates down so good for the health of the plants and productivity either it affects or not. So that may be a complex thing.
Yeah, I can actually borrow the answer from Madita saying that it's a complex situation. And indeed, like we don't understand in so much details everything. We have a comprehensive picture of the events, but there are things which are not entirely clear. And your question being so broad cannot be answered with specific reply. But so you would have accumulation of reactive oxygen species in the chloroplast as well, like singlet oxygen and superoxide, because all these processes are related. So photorespiration, as you remember, is not happening only in the peroxisomes, but it also happens in cytosol, chloroplast, mitochondria, and all these reactions are somehow interlinked and would influence each other and have a feedback forward loop mechanisms. So there will be accumulation of not only hydrogen peroxide, but also other reactive oxygen species, which might have beneficial or detrimental effects. And we are looking for the beneficial effects. So you're asking about seed priming, which is another way to prime garden plants, not just by spraying biostimulant on the leaves or fertilizing of them, but simply preparing the seed by coating with certain biostimulant or priming agent so that when they germinate, they're prepared to withstand some changes in the environment. So this is like one of the approaches people are using in agriculture. And it's actually the most practical because you don't have to anticipate the stress. You can pre-treat the seed, it can be ready, and it can react.
So major challenge the farmers is facing the finance, the kind of income or the capital they do have, they have not the capital to adopt the several technology. And the another important challenge the farmers are facing, they do not have access to the right information. So how we can provide the appropriate informations to them? So they are not, they are some of the practices they are following, but the kind of information they are getting, they are not getting from the proper channel. The information they are getting from the input dealers. So most of the input dealers are the private entities. So they whatever advices they give on their own benefit, not for the farmers' benefit. So sometimes farmer adopting, but they are not getting the benefit. So these are the challenges the farmers are facing.
Yes, so I think there are several papers that actually treat this topic. So I didn't work on it, but I read those papers, so that's what I will base it on now. So in the next decades, it's expected that the temperature is rising, that the atmosphere itself is changing, and this will all be improving the conditions for insects, basically. So of course, there will also be some insect species that will be suffering under this. So I don't say that every single insect species will increase in numbers. But for example, in forest regions, it's expected that there will be a lot of more insects, and also that these insects are migrating to different regions because maybe their region is not very suitable for them anymore because of the changes, or maybe another region besides to it gets suitable. So there will also be new insects that can attack the plants then, and these are then insects that they haven't seen before, that they have no stress defense probably for. So that's also an additional stress for them.
Question for Colin. My life, my people, and my way, and everything. We don't focus on like what we can do for nature, what we can do for our nature. Just like as we all know that today in each aspect of our life we just depend on nature. In each and every today I am just inhaling just because of oxygen. And I have a question to you, sir, that how can I motivate people? We have farmers here, we have my peer group, my colleagues. How can I motivate them to do a few things that are important for nature? As I know that you are the best motivator. Uh, then this is my question to you. Then thank you, sir.
Khalid, it takes a second for it to kick in.
Hello. No problem. I guess either of the things work. I hope I'm audible. So I'll try to answer that question in a sense that a lot of you kind of understand. You asked कि हम continuously सोचते हैं कि हमारे बारे में क्या, हमारी इस लाइफस्टाइल, हमारे बेनिफिट्स, हमारा कंफर्ट. The other question you asked कि हम ये नहीं सोचते कि हम नेचर के लिए क्या कर सकते हैं, right? Now we have to think from it in two aspects. एक, हम क्या कर सकते हैं नेचर के लिए, दूसरा हम नेचर के लिए क्या नहीं कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि हमारे इतना कुछ करने की वजह से ही प्रॉब्लम्स क्रिएट हुई हैं बहुत सारी. तो वी नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड इट इन बोथ एस्पेक्ट्स, what we can contribute and what we can stop doing or what we can avoid doing. And that is why the entire concept of mission life has also come into play. That is, we need to remodel or kind of bring alterations into our lifestyle that it is now designed for environmental sustainability. And if we do not do it now on a voluntary basis on ourselves, then the government would be forced to do it. I'll take a very recent example of France, where France has brought in a legislation where they're trying to ban short distance flights for which high speed trains are already available. So even for 50, 60, 80, 100 kilometers, people used to continuously take flights. The amount of emissions of a flight is multiple times more than what is, for example, of a train or even a car, right? But people were used to do it because that had become a very instinctive part of their lifestyle. Or another thing that has come up into the fray is of, say, fast fashion, where people wear a cloth for, say, 2 or 3 times and then change and buy a new cloth because they have access of income. Now, a lot of consumption has simply become on the basis of the income that you have, and people are doing excess expenditure or consumption which is not essentially needed. This also, now the other or the flip side of it is this also goes contrary to the traditional economic model, because our GDP is calculated on the basis of how much consumption is happening or how much production we are taking into place. So all of this needs to be balanced again. But from a very frugal point of view, if you look at it, a lot of expenditure that we are doing can simply be restricted, avoided, or managed in a manner that is notwithstanding or basically avoids environmental harm. And this needs to be brought into our own lifestyle. तो उसके लिए consciousness develop करनी पड़ेगी, which cannot come up from an individual point of view. आप अपने लिए भी कर सकते हो, तो वो तो आपको करना ही है. That is an individual responsibility how we are contributing. But the broader aspect is how do you bring it into a more broader sense where your social circles, your societies, your educational institutions, your peers also do it. Now we live in a mindset or a kind of circumstance in society where a lot of these things are dependent upon how cool a thing is or how trendy it is or how much it is going on social media. And that is why it is important that we bring it into the mainstream, that people understand that if you are, say, avoiding an expenditure, or for example taking a train instead of flight, it's not because that you earn less, or for example you do not have those resources, or you're being frugal, or I mean cheap in that sense, but rather because you are making it a conscious decision. And this conscious understanding needs to be brought into the mainstream. And whether you utilize the aspect or the target of mission life, utilize its goals, take it to the people, or from a very personalized perspective appeal to your friends, that is up to you. But we in ourselves need to take that responsibility to work towards environmental consciousness and bring it into our lifestyle. That is one challenge that we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalid. And to close the session, I'd just like to say that if we want to take an action, it has to be told to us in a language that we understand. किसान को किसान की भाषा में समझाओगे तो वो समझेगा, किसान को मॉलिक्यूलर पाथवे समझाओगे तो उसको नहीं समझेगा. सिमिलरली पॉलिसी वालों को हम दिखाएंगे कि आम आदमियों पे क्या फर्क पड़ता है तो वो समझेंगे, सिर्फ पॉलिसी बना के हम पे थोपेंगे तो हम भी नहीं मानेंगे. इसीलिए आई थिंक इट्स अ कलेक्टिव कॉन्शियसनेस, एक सम्मिलित करके हमको एक कुछ उपाय लाना पड़ेगा जिससे सब ये समझ सके कि हर एक क्या क्या रोल प्ले कर सकता है उसमें, एंड देन एवरीबॉडी ट्राइज टू सॉल्व फॉर इट. With this, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Vikram, to close the session. Thank you.
So we come to the end of this session. Thank you, Renu, and all the panelists for an excellent deliberation and discussion. We can have more discussions with the panelists of this group after the or during the lunch. I request Professor Bhuminath Tripathi sir, Professor Raksha Singh, Professor Poonam Sharma ma'am, and Dr. Sanjeev Singh to come on the stage and felicitate our panelists.